Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca and I'm the Urban Ag Extension Educator for Lake County, Indiana. Today I'm going to be talking about the plant disease diagnostic and control topic for the Master Gardener Local County Connection for Northwest Indiana. So we're going to start by talking about Septoria leaf spot in tomatoes. So let's look over here. So this is Septoria leaf spot, and if we look at the whole plant, these are my tomatoes in my garden, it starts at the base of the plant, so it's not really up at the top of the plant, it's at the old growth at the bottom, and it starts with yellowing with some brown spots. And so that Septoria leaf spot doesn't really infect the fruit. It usually comes out after the fruit has set, so I do have some fruit here on these cherry tomatoes, but it doesn't usually infect the fruit. So if your fruit starts to look a little strange, it's probably another kind of infection, not the Septoria leaf spot. But the Septoria leaf spot does have characteristic brown leaves with kind of tan or gray centers. So you can see some good examples here of the brown rings with gray centers. That's very characteristic of Septoria leaf spot, this fungal infection. And like I said, it moves from old growth near the bottom of the plant to the new growth up top. So it's already starting to move kind of upwards on the plant. It thrives in hot, humid conditions and overwinters in infected plant matter or other members of the nightshade family. So it can also overwinter in weeds in the nightshade family, which I'll provide some descriptions, some examples in the description below. But one way that you can kind of help prevent this from spreading to your crops next year is by removing the plant matter. And that's good practice for any garden, is just to remove all of the plants at the end of the season. So once they're all done for the season in the fall, I'll take them out and I won't compost them because that could transmit the disease to the next year. Instead, I'll just bag them and throw them away, or I'll more likely burn them. And then I'll also make sure to weed in the garden. I don't think this is this is a grass, so it's probably not going to hang on to the Septoria leaf spot, but it's just good practice to weed the garden to prevent them from hanging on to any diseases. Some other ways that you can help are to mulch in your garden, because the mulch will keep water from splashing the soil, which could have the fungal infection in the soil. It'll keep the water from splashing up onto the plant. So mulching, I just used some dry grass clippings. I waited until the grass clippings dried in my yard and they didn't have the seeds anymore that were still active, so I just put a nice layer, like 2 to 3 inches in here, and so that does a lot of things. It keeps your garden, the roots of the crops nice and cool and hydrated, and it holds moisture, but it also keeps the soil-borne illnesses from splashing back up onto the plant. Speaking about watering, another thing that you can do is to avoid overhead watering. So I'm not going to water up here, I'm going to water down here at the base of the plants, because a lot of fungal infections do spread through water, so I'm going to avoid that. I also want to have good air circulation for the plants, so to do that, I want to space the plants out pretty well. So mine are about 18 inches apart, which is pretty good since I have the cages. Using cages or stakes can keep the plants upright and keep them off the ground and keep them spaced out. Something else I can do is I can prune the suckers that come off from the base of the plant. So you'll see here I have some suckers, and it's probably a little too late to prune them, and I'm not probably going to prune them, but that's one way I can help keep good air circulation, is by pruning these suckers, because then it's not as crowded and there's more airflow, which is what the plants need. I can also sanitize these cages at the end of the seasons before next year. So because the cages and tools can hold the fungal infection and other diseases, it's good practice to sanitize your tools, which include these cages. So I can use a store-bought garden sanitizer for the garden, or I can make my own solution of bleach or alcohol-based dilution to sanitize these, so that the tools that I used in my cages aren't hanging on to that fungal infection. I can also rotate my crops. So this is just full of tomatoes here. Next year I won't plant anything in the nightshade family in this garden bed. I'll plant something else. So I'll avoid things like peppers and eggplants and other tomatoes in this garden bed this year, because plants from the same family tend to have the same diseases. So I'll avoid that and plant something else here for the next couple of years, just so that the soil has time to recover from any infections that might have gotten into it. If I get to the point where the Septoria leaf spot really starts to take over, like if it gets pretty bad, like it's getting a little worse over here with this guy starting to travel up the plant, if it starts to look pretty bad, it can actually prevent the plant from doing photosynthesis and getting the nutrients that it needs to survive. So I might consider a fungicide treatment. And if I choose to do a fungicide treatment, I could apply something with ingredients like chlorothalonil, maneb, macareb, or copper. And copper is an organic fungicide that is used to treat a lot of fungal infections and some bacterial infections. So I could use that and spray like once a week until I don't need to anymore. So just once a week until harvest if it starts to get bad. And fungicides really are preventative, so it's not going to treat the leaves that are infected already. It's not going to like make these come back to what they were before, but it'll prevent the leaves that are still clean from getting infected. So that's what fungicides do, is they're preventative, they're not treating. So that's Septoria leaf spot. Next, we're going to be talking about rust, and I'm going to be specifically using this example of cedar apple rust on this apple tree. Let's take a look. Rusts are a fungal infection. They can have one host or multiple hosts. Cedar apple rust, for example, are very common, and they infect crab apples or apple trees in the spring and cedar or juniper trees in the late summer. In spring, orange gelatinous horns develop from brown galls on juniper trees and are blown to infect apple trees. They appear as yellow spots that enlarge and turn orange on the apple trees, and then the yellow or orange or brown lesions form under the leaves or on fruit with small whisker-like spore-producing structures. So you can see here we have these orange-yellow spots on top of the leaves, and then if we turn the leaves over, you can see these kind of 3D spore-producing spots. And so that infection will just go back and forth, back and forth. So one way that sometimes people try to break the infection cycle is by removing any cedar or juniper trees from the property to break that cycle. But since the disease can spread on the wind, on the air for up to 2 miles, and you can't really always control the juniper and cedar trees for 2-mile radius, the most effective way to prevent this disease is to avoid planting susceptible varieties and plant resistant varieties of these apple trees. So I'll list that in the link below. There'll be a description link that has a publication for resistant varieties. You can also use a fungicide listed in another publication linked below. And remember that fungicides are preventative, so they won't cure the infection that's already here, but they'll prevent other leaves from being infected. So now let's talk about bacterial leaf spots, and this is a mulberry tree, likely a white mulberry tree, which is the most common and also invasive. The red mulberry trees are the ones that aren't invasive here, but they're a lot less common. So these bacterial spots will start as dark spots with a yellow halo, so that's what we have here. Sometimes the center of the spot will fall out, so I'll show another example of that where the spot, actually here we go. So this spot has fallen out, so it gives like a shot hole, so you can like kind of see through that leaf. and that can be pretty extreme. So the spots can actually get larger, and then you'll see like large holes in the trees sometimes. So I'll show an example of that. And sometimes they'll form together to create larger blotches. So you can kind of see that starting to happen over here. And it can also infect shoots, buds, and flowers, and they can become blighted or wilted. And I'll try to find an example of that too. They can travel on air or water, the bacteria. Only sprays with copper or streptomycin as an active ingredient can prevent bacterial diseases. So again, just like with the fungicides, it's not going to treat what's already here, but it'll prevent other leaves from becoming infected. And so copper, which is also an effective organic fungicide, is an option, and then also that streptomycin. Management for bacterial diseases, similar to fungal prevention, is really just keep the plant healthy and plant appropriately. So like do your research before you plant a tree or a plant. Make sure that it's in the right area so it's going to be successful. It has the right kind of soil, the right nutrients, the right pH. Do your soil test, make sure it's getting the right nutrition, and don't fertilize unless your soil test indicates that it's necessary. So if your soil test says that you need to change the soil by adding fertilizer, great. If not, avoid doing so, because that can actually harm the plant as well. So keep the tree healthy, mulch around the base of the tree, water it during drought, water it deeply, thoroughly, avoid overhead watering, avoid sprinkler watering, which a lot of people tend to do. Instead, just water at the base. Prune the tree to make sure it has good airflow. Remove infected leaves when they fall on the ground. So you see some infected leaves down here. I'll have to rake those up and burn them, or bag them and throw them away so that they can't reinfect the plant next year. Fungicides are typically not necessary unless the plant has lost most of its leaves several years in a row. So if it's just starting to look like this, fungicides typically not recommended. Just raking up the leaves, pruning, just making sure the plant has enough water and fertilizer that it needs. And remember that fungicides are preventative. And if you do use them, it's recommended to use them in the spring. But to do a full-size tree, you're going to need a high-pressure sprayer to get to the whole canopy of the tree. So it's recommended to hire a professional arborist. So that's bacterial spots. So I mentioned with the bacterial spots, they can get kind of a shot hole appearance. So that's kind of what's going on here with this cherry tree. Probably some other stuff too, but you get that shot hole appearance from the bacterial spots forming together and in the necrotic or dead part of the leaves falling out. So it's likely that this cramp bark has a few different issues going on, some pest damage it looks like, but also maybe some bacterial infection. So you can kind of see these like little white spots and some holes in the leaves, but you also see this kind of blighting happening, which is in response to a bacterial infection where the leaves are just dying. So that happens sometimes, and sometimes like the whole branch will just be blighted and die. So that's typically a sign of some sort of bacterial infection. Now, even though this isn't a plant disease, I wanted to show you guys this example of herbicide injury. So you see how the leaves are kind of weird colored. This is a honeysuckle that I actually did trim back and apply. I applied an herbicide to prevent it from coming back, but I'm gonna have to reapply it to really kill it because honeysuckle is invasive, or Asian bush honeysuckle is invasive. So you'll see it's kind of like curling and kind of scrunchy looking and maybe a little shinier than normal. These leaf deformalities, see it's kind of growing back a little smaller than normal and a little curly. That might look like a disease to a lot of people, but a lot of times it's herbicide damage, either because they applied herbicide somewhere nearby or even from farm fields. It can blow off of a farm field, and that's called herbicide drift and cause this kind of damage. So And usually the plant can bounce back from herbicide damage if it's not too bad. It won't be 100% the same, but it can bounce back and survive. So let's talk about tar spot on maple for a little bit. Tar spot is a kind of fungal infection, but it's not usually seen as something we have to do anything about, really. It causes these tar-like 3D structures to form on the surface of the leaves. Usually in the late spring, early summer, you'll start to see yellow spots, yellow or brown spots on the leaves, and then they'll kind of form into these tar spots, and then they'll still have that like yellow halo around them. Maybe see it a little better over here. And this can reduce the amount of photosynthesis that the tree is doing and cause premature defoliation, but it's not usually recommended to use fungicide because the tree will usually just heal itself and it's not usually that detrimental to the tree. One way that you can prevent it from getting worse the next year is just by raking up the fallen leaves or mulching them and disposing of them or burning them. Yeah, so not usually something you have to do much of anything about, but important to mention because it is very common. Now I wanted to talk about anthracnose, which is a term for a few types of leaf spot or blight fungal infections, which thrive in cool, wet springs that favor these fungal infections spreading because fungi like cool, wet conditions and humidity. They can appear as browning along the leaf margins or between the leaf veins. So the leaf margins are like these, you know, the edges of the leaves. So you can see along the leaf edges there's browning, and there's also some browning kind of in between the leaf veins, you can see here. And it kind of forms these blotches of brown necrotic or dead tissue in between the veins. Each type of anthracnose is specific to its host plant. So anthracnose in an oak tree won't infect an ash tree, for example. All anthracnose requires water to spread. So you can manage this disease by raking and removing fallen leaves from under the tree, mulch them or remove them, burn them before winter so it can't reinfect the next year. Prune the tree for good airflow, mulch underneath the tree 3 to 4 inches with wood chips, for example, or grass clippings, but leave a couple of inches, leave like 2 inches between the mulch and the base of the tree. You can use protective fungicide as needed. In grapes, it can be brown circles with gray centers, which look kind of like bacterial infections. So those grape leaves can get anthracnose as well. You can water at the base of the tree and avoid overhead watering, so avoid sprinklers. Space the trees apart and plant them appropriately. So remember to think about doing your research. Go on research-based sites, science-based sites, like use your extension resources, use Morton Arboretum, because different trees tolerate different types of soil, maybe sandy, silty, loamy, clay soil, or they tolerate different types of pH. For example, pine trees, a lot of people plant pine trees here in Northwest Indiana, and then they worry because they're not doing so well because pine trees need acidic soil and we have very alkaline soil. We also have pretty heavy clay soil and we get a lot of flooding. So we have to keep that in mind when we're planting our trees, because the best way to combat these diseases is to prevent them. So plant trees appropriately and make sure that they're healthy and given the conditions they need to thrive. So, and I think this plant probably also has some other issues. There might be some herbicide damage here. I'm pretty sure this is a box elder, and I had applied some fungicide because there was honeysuckle underneath, so it's probably got a few different issues going on, but that's a good example of anthracnose. This is another example of anthracnose. It's on a cherry tree, so that brown leaf margins or leaf edges. This is a good example of powdery mildew on pumpkins. So powdery mildew is one of the easiest to recognize fungal infections because of the powdery white, almost talcum powder-like substance on the leaf surfaces, so you get this white powder. It can infect all sorts of plants. The best way to prevent this is to get resistant varieties, so you can purchase resistant varieties of seeds and plants to powdery mildew, because prevention is the most effective. The fungus does not need water, so that's pretty unique for powdery mildew. It can travel on air, and it really prefers humid air. So you'll see this disease a lot in greenhouses and hoop houses. An important thing to manage this disease is to have good air circulation. So I planted my plants really close together, so I have my peas, my pumpkins, and my beans. So that's probably not so good. Next time I'll give them their own bed, and I won't plant them in the same bed again, because it can, different kinds of powdery mildew infect different plants, even though a lot of different plants are susceptible to powdery mildews generally. So I haven't seen the powdery mildew infecting the beans or peas. It's really just infecting the pumpkins and squash, because they're all in the same family. So I'll just make sure not to plant them in this bed again for the next few years. And then I can also spread the plants out and prune any infected material. So I did prune some that were really infected to keep them from spreading to each other. And the infection will stay over winter in infected plant debris, so I'll make sure to remove this plant matter at the end of the year and burn it or bag and trash it. I won't compost it to reduce the spread of the infection. And you can also avoid planting in the shade, and avoid late summer nitrogen application, because late summer nitrogen application will encourage more foliage to grow, more of the green stuff, not the plants, because that's what nitrogen does, and that can lead to more heavy infection, because you're causing there to be more foliage, and so then you have less air circulation and you have more surfaces for the powdery mildew to infect. You can also avoid overhead watering, just like all of these infections. Avoid overhead watering to reduce humidity and keep the disease from spreading. Remove infected plant parts at the end of the year. And then if you do get to a point like I did where it was really heavily infected for a while, you can apply sulfur, neem oil, copper, potassium bicarbonate based fungicides to prevent further infection. So again, if I apply a fungicide to this plant, it's not going to get better, but I can keep it from spreading to this plant, for example, or this leaf, because it's the same plant. So that's powdery mildew. So the last thing I wanted to show you guys was this choke cherry bush that has a terrible case of probably multiple fungal issues, including, I think, some powdery mildew. And you might be wondering, like, how did I let this get so bad? It's really, like, not doing so well. This amount of infection will definitely be cause for use of some fungicide applications, but when we look at the whole issue, you can see where the plant is located. And I did not plant this plant, it came with the house. It's right underneath where the roof actually spills water over quite often, so that bush is just constantly getting sprayed with water coming from the roof. So it's actually going to get moved. I'm going to move it this fall to an area where it won't get poured on anymore, and I'll also do a preventative fungicide application, probably just some copper, but that should help. And then if I were to keep it in this location or move it slightly over, I would pick up all of the leaves. Really, I'll probably do this just to keep it from spreading to any other plants, but I'll pick up the leaves and throw them away or burn them, just to keep it from spreading to other plants. So I wanted to leave you guys with that. Thanks for attending the Local County Connection piece for the Master Gardener course, Plant Disease Diagnostic and Control for Northwest Indiana. Thanks, and see you next time.